Good morning, Grid Connections listeners. Welcome back to Grid Connections, the podcast where we explore all things transportation, clean energy, and our power grid, connecting all of these systems together. In today's episode, we're joined by Cantor, Research Director at the Zero Emission Transportation Association, or ZETA for short. His role in the conversation we had takes a data-driven look at the EV transition, from public charging visibility to the scale of U.S. manufacturing jobs. Corey shares what the numbers really say about market growth, consumer confidence, and how battery prices are quietly transforming everything from passenger cars to school buses. We also dig into policies like the 30D Clean Vehicle Credit and the 45X manufacturing tax credits, and why building a domestic supply chain is about more than just cars. It's about economic competitiveness and industrial resilience. Some of the takeaways from this episode: we cover why battery prices are the real unsung hero of the EV boom, what the data says about consumer barriers and how they're shifting, how visibility and proximity to charging stations influence buyer intent, and what's happening across the EV ecosystem from Lamppost chargers to lithium mines. If you're curious about where EV adoption is headed and what's working behind the scenes to drive it, this is an episode you don't want to miss. But please do us a favor. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with one person who might love it too, and leave us a positive review on your podcast app. It really does help us grow. Plus, we've got a big announcement. We just launched Grid Connections Consulting, helping partners make sense of the evolving EV and electrification landscape. Be sure to check it out at gridconnections.co. And don't forget to sign up for our new newsletter as well, using the link in the show notes to get even more insights from Grid Connections delivered straight to your inbox. With that, enjoy.
Thank you so much for having me, Chase. Yeah, always really a good time to talk about electric vehicles and kind of nerd out on different aspects of the transition. So appreciate you having me.
Our pleasure. And we'll have links to some of the previous episodes we've had with ZETA, but just in case anyone listening today isn't familiar with what your team does, can you just share a little bit of background about the organization and then what you do at ZETA as well?
Yeah, so we are a trade association that represents the EV and battery supply chain, advocating for more investment in the U.S. EV and battery supply chain, more jobs across, all the way from critical mineral producers to EV OEMs to battery manufacturers and charging companies. And so ZETA Works is based down in DC, focusing on a lot of the major federal incentive and policy issues down there, and also works hard to make sure that the industry's perspective is heard. And then within the kind of ZETA team, on the research side, I like to think of myself as a support player among many of our functions. So whether it's communications and conversations like we're having here today, we're helping our Great Hill staff work on their kind of federal affairs strategy with more research and data. And policy as well. So a little bit of everything, Chase, trying to mix it up here.
Well, I think as the research director, what are the trends that you're seeing that are really kind of maybe standing out to you right now, or maybe things that you don't think are getting enough attention that is really kind of coming out with the data that your team's finding?
Yeah, I think when it comes to EV transition in general, right, there is so much news on a weekly basis or a daily basis that there isn't often enough stepping back to just see how far the industry has come in a fairly short period of time, both kind of globally, but then also in the US perspective.
Yeah.
I went to graduate school in 2017, and that was the first time global passenger EV sales hit 1 million units. That was, I guess, 8 years ago now. And the whole global industry doubled in about a 2-year time. So went into grad school, left grad school, and it was, twice as big at 2 million units. Last year, global passenger EV sales hit 17 million units. And again, just magnitudes larger in such a short period of time, reaching about 20% of all new car sales. That's a really positive story. And the US has kind of followed that trend. We saw about 1 million units being broken for the first time back in 2023. And then in 2024, EV sales here in the US grew by about 21%. That's including both battery electric and plug-in hybrid for that data. For fully electric vehicles, up about 15%. But it's this constant kind of improvement. Another metric I think that a lot of people in the industry, and I'm sure your listeners have heard, is electric vehicle share of sales, right? So when I started my previous role, which was at Bloomberg NEF, a research firm, EV share of sale in the US in 2019 was about 2%. And last year we were at 10% in 2024. So that's in about a 5-year period, growing by 5x. It's a positive story. And it's not to say we can't get into some real challenges and uncertainty that the industry is facing. But we're talking about, fundamentally changing the automotive industry, something that hasn't happened for about 100 years. So it's really exciting. And you have to kind of step back and see the forest for the trees sometimes. And I think if you're, working around all these companies, it's really fun and interesting to see all of the kind of different approaches to the transition.
Yeah, I think that's a great call out. I was at the EV Charging Summit and Expo last week, and I think there were maybe some people who were either newer to the industry or kind of like down on just some of the headlines and news out there. But when you start talking about like how quickly this transition has happened, I mean, one of the big things I like to always remind people is EVs have been a thing for the last decade, but it's actually only within the last few years that there are electric vehicles that consumers can buy, sometimes out of their price range. But there weren't even electric trucks until just a few years ago.
Yeah.
So much of the American automotive segment, and now we're not only seeing more of these, but we're finally starting to see even that start to come down in cost. And I think in addition to that, something you hit on that's really just wild to me is not only is the EV market growing, and part of that is now due to more and more of these different vehicle types being available for consumers and businesses alike, but it's also the domestic auto market, at least last year for 2024, was actually shrinking and not doing very well. So I think there was a lot of stuff kind of getting conflating with, oh, the automotive market's not doing well, it must be electric vehicles or why. But in reality, it was the actual combustion or electric vehicle, the actual total automotive market was shrinking. And yet during all of that and some of the headwinds, the actual electric vehicle slice of that pie was still growing at a pretty impressive rate.
No, I mean, if you look at this kind of in the US market, we have a good stat that we actually put up on our ZETA website. Just the compound annual growth rate of these kind of alternative drivetrains, so BEVs, PHEVs, and also hybrids, are really impressive over the past decade. I mean, BEVs and PHEVs were both growing by a CAGR, which is always an awkward word to say, but about 42% for both over that kind of 2015 to 2024 period. And then hybrids in the conventional sense were about 19%, which is, nothing to slouch at given that they had made up a good portion of sales already. So it is exciting to see. And I think there is a lot of kind of short-term uncertainty for the auto market overall. But on the whole, you just see so many more OEMs releasing EV models than even 2 or 3 years ago. And everyone, like you kind of alluded to, is offering different price points or different kind of segments. But that's a landmark shift from 2017, where there was one major US automaker and maybe a few kind of models with much more limited range.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I mean, back in 2017, it was the Model 3 was like just now coming out, and otherwise it was mostly their sedan and like the Nissan Leaf. And within, as crazy it is, 8 years, we now have so many more other sedan options at all sorts of price ranges. We have the entry of electric trucks and a lot of these things, I think, that really make it a much better proposition for the average American consumer to really go electric. Obviously, the second part of that is once you've got electric, is having that infrastructure there to support it.
Yeah.
And there was actually some really interesting data that your team shared. And I think it was kind of like, as of February 2025, if I'm reading this correctly, there were over 75,000 public charging locations. And what's fascinating too was like, obviously California has kind of been known as like the EV electric vehicle kind of hub for the past decade. But there's now more EV charging ports than there are gas nozzles. And I'm kind of curious to kind of maybe unpack a little bit more of that and what your team is seeing and understanding around just the rollout of the infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I think on that point, Chase, so again, I live in New York City and Brooklyn. And a couple of years ago, maybe it was last year, maybe 2 years ago, there was a piece saying that there were more EV charging ports than gas stations on Manhattan. Now, if you're familiar with Manhattan, there aren't a ton of gas stations there. But the overall point is that
that's a low bar.
I think that so much of the kind of early stage of EVs, there's been this thinking of, range anxiety or charging anxiety. This is so much more difficult because it's not like our gas station experience. But when you kind of add all of the different ways that you can charge, from level 2 chargers that are being built, from fast charging stations that are being built across the country, you begin to see that what is initially kind of a barrier or challenge for EV adoption will eventually, I think, become something really beneficial. My dad and sister both have an EV, and I think once you make the shift to an electric vehicle, you treat it so much more like a phone. And I'm sure many of your listeners feel that way. You're topping off in a different way than you did, uh, you know, for gas when maybe you were only going when you were at 25% of a tank. With EVs, if you're like, oh, it makes sense to charge a little bit. And there's a well-known Department of Energy stat that 80% of charging takes place at home. And so a lot of people have that really positive charging experience. And OEMs, in fact, are encouraging more home charging with, including a home charger in the case of some like Ford or other particular incentives. Now, on the stat that we sent you over around the 75,000 public charging locations and the 221,000, give or take, connectors, that's doubled since 2021. So again, it's moving in the right direction. I think there is still a long way to go. California is a really robust market that has been working on charging infrastructure for 10 years. And new programs federally have kind of helped hone everyone else to kind of focus on charging. But I think DOE even said last year that 1,000 new charging connectors were being added every week in 2024. So progress, right? So I mean, so much of this stuff is we've come such a long way, and there's still quite a bit to go. But if you're looking to buy an EV, we touched on the kind of upfront cost, and we're touching on the charging. Those are the two things that have improved dramatically in even 2 years' time.
Yeah, and I think I was just even recently reminded. I mean, you're talking about like level 2 charging, and
Yeah,
just with the EV charging summit I was at last week. Obviously, DC fast charging has a large role to play in this transition, but I was just even reminded through the conversations I had there. And then a couple months ago, we had a rental and we have 2 electric vehicles. And at that rental, there was only level 1 charging. And both my wife and I drive quite a bit. We easily do 30,000 miles a year. And it was kind of wild to be in this rental where we were both charging our cars on the same thing we charge our toothbrushes on, our electric toothbrushes on. And I was surprised how easy it was and how well it worked. Not
yeah.
like as far as like there being a failure or something, but I'm just like, oh, and maybe it's just because we've had EVs for a while. I had a feeling like I thought it was just going to be much more of a tension. And it just to me shows that there's so much opportunity for like even especially you in New York area, like talk of like using lampposts and other kind of areas to just even get level 1 for like on-street parking and those sorts of things more easily accessible for more people.
There is so much innovation in charging. Plenty of friends or companies that I know well here, friends doing startups like It's Electric or a bunch of Lamppost charging companies coming out of New Lab, which is kind of clean energy hub here in New York City. Um, I think it also goes to your point, Chase, of like how big this whole EV ecosystem is. A lot of friends who aren't familiar with the transition will just assume that like the major OEMs are the companies that are invested. And then you're like, well, there's also these big charging companies that are doing fast charging, but there's also these level 2 charging companies. And there's all the upstream, folks who are working on the materials and the battery manufacturers. So it's so much bigger and I think more interesting than you might just and I like cars. I love reading about the cars. I'm going to go with my dad and maybe fiance to the car show in New York in a couple weeks. So yeah, we could talk about how exciting it is to see all the new product and how much better they've gotten. But it's a broad ecosystem here. City charging is tough though. I don't want to say there's a lot of kind of permitting issues and challenges around the topic. But people are invested in making it work. And I think that's another big change. As more and more companies have put out compelling EVs and Americans are buying them, more and more people, see the opportunity there to kind of aid the transition.
Well, and you guys are also spoiled in the New York area with the ultimate electric vehicle of just the subway system. And you don't have to worry about charging at all there. So, but I think those are totally fair call outs. And I think you're right. Let's kind of go up the supply chain. And I think that's what's really fascinating about some of the things that ZETA deals with is you pretty much have the full supply chain as far as clients. And I think the battery material, I mean, obviously like a lot of the focus of these tariffs and other things that have been kind of going in are around trying to promote and facilitate even more domestic manufacturing and supply chain. So
Yeah.
I'd love to kind of hear what your clients in that realm are kind of focused on, and maybe some of the things that, especially for those listening who are maybe more focused on the cars and the charging infrastructure, what they're maybe not thinking about or just haven't heard about in those conversations.
Yeah. I mean, I think one big picture way to look at this is, and this is according to Atlas Public Policy, there's been about $190 billion just since 2020 invested in the EV and battery supply chain here in the US. So that includes everything from your lithium miners and lithium mines through what we've referred to as the midstream, which is around the cathode and anode materials that go into batteries, as well as refining, which needs a little bit more focus or a lot bit more focus here in the US, to battery cells. And there are many producers here who are ZETA members who are working on that important work, to the cars themselves. And then even after that, you've got charging and grid integration, all the way down to what are you going to do with an EV battery in 10 to 15 years? Does it have a second life? Does it have the ability to get recycled? So I kind of listed out a bunch right there. I mean, there's ZETA members at pretty much every single one of those points. And I think, from each of their perspectives, the importance of the industry growth is paramount, because having that kind of policy certainty in place, having a kind of robust EV market, allows every aspect of the supply chain to flourish. Right? If you know that consumers are going to buy EVs, you can open up new facilities and battery factories to support those electric vehicles. If you know that there are going to be more EVs, then you can build out charging, or you can build out battery recycling. And so, just like I'm sure in the automotive industry in general, having that policy certainty is important. And that's why ZETA, has worked hard for advocating for credits like the 30D clean car tax credit and 45X, a lot of that manufacturing. And it's a lot of jobs across the country. And ZETA has been, hard at work kind of bringing awareness to many of these regions that have been seeing kind of a battery boom, whether you're talking about places like Savannah, Georgia, or Reno, Nevada, or many different parts of the country.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious when you're talking about the
Yeah.
supply chain. I mean, obviously, people think like lithium mining or
Mhm.
sometimes cobalt and some of these other things. I'm kind of curious, like, is what are you hearing from some of these as like what is needed more? Because obviously, I think for a while there was a big push about like the need for graphite, and maybe that wasn't kind of getting the coverage. Or, I mean, you kind of have to go into a pretty uh, in-depth conversation with people in the industry to know like that's actually something that was kind of more needed in the battery pack
Yeah.
side. And I'm kind of curious if you've just heard any shifts, because there have been a lot of talks about more of the manufacturing and mining domestically, especially for like lithium. But
Yeah.
if there's kind of any advances you've heard in that, or what are still kind of like the pain points for what's needed most from those suppliers.
I mean, I'm not going to speak for, I think, any of the individual companies, just because, you're welcome to have them on the show and kind of ask their approach. I, I think this idea of, when you look at building up a robust market, even in places like Europe or China, it took, it wasn't like a light switch, right?
Right.
You look at Norway, which is the kind of quintessential EV market example, or even California, it takes time and policy certainty to kind of level that out. So, ZETA has been working hard to point out the benefits of things like 30D's demand pull, or the 45X advanced manufacturing credit on not only battery manufacturing, but around critical minerals. And in both cases, 30D being so stringent around what critical minerals or what battery components you can use. That kind of overall kind of symbiosis, I think, is important. And having the certainty that, if a company is making these investments, to have the kind of runway to see that the landscape won't necessarily change too much. Again, every aspect of the supply chain is a little bit different, right? If you're a charging company, you have different needs than if you're, let's say,
True.
a lithium mine. But each of these folks are a little bit interdependent on the other, right? It's not like um, one part of the supply chain, if it's overly vulnerable, doesn't create a gap. But I think what's so great about the work that ZETA is doing is we really are focused on each of it, and our members are pretty enthusiastic about the transition. I mean, talking about just the kind of paradigm shift from even a couple of years ago. You're hearing folks across the kind of political spectrum recognize that the EV transition is now. Um, and I think that's exciting too. And I think that's an important step. So it's not necessarily a policy ask, Chase.
Hmm.
There are plenty of policy asks I think that all these groups have. But it's really a recognition that everyone has got to kind of work together to kind of build out this EV ecosystem here in the US.
Yeah, I think that's a great call. And maybe it would also help to kind of take a step back. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, you've kind of alluded to a couple of these, I guess, the 45X, the third, some of
Mhm.
those policies are kind of helping implement and make this happen. For those who are listening who may not be familiar, could you share a little bit more detail about what those are specifically, and then maybe some of the positive outcomes and wins we've seen from them?
Yeah, I'll give a high level
Yeah,
just
yeah.
because we got a great policy team and a great policy director, and so also a good guest, for future episodes. But 30D is what is typically referred to as the clean car tax credit. That's your $7,500 for consumers who go out and purchase an electric vehicle. In a couple years ago, they made some changes to 30D to tie it much more closely to onshoring or friendshoring with U.S. free trade agreement allies, or being final assembled here in North America to qualify for the credit. So when you've seen automakers move their production of electric vehicles to the U.S., typically it's been so that their vehicle can have access to the 30D tax credit, and the IRS and Treasury have a list of which cars are qualifying, and it has changed a little bit from year to year. Um, there's also additional credits around commercial vehicles that also offer either $7,500 or more if it's a kind of electric truck. And then 45X is a per kilowatt hour kind of subsidy for battery manufacturing, or a kind of percentage around critical minerals. So 35 for cell and $10 per kilowatt hour per pack. Has a benefit differently depending on how your joint venture or your company is set up. But each of these policies were devised in a way that could encourage more people to change their suppliers and bring them closer here to the US. And so ZETA has been hard at work, and our and regulatory, our federal affairs team has been working hard to, just show that it's not just about the incentive, but really the incentive is tied to many of these manufacturing facilities that are either built here in the US or about to be built. That kind of demand pull is important, because if you're an OEM, you want to make sure that people are able to afford the cars, and that you're making a worthwhile investment.
Thank you. And I think that totally makes sense as far as what we're seeing with that kind of consistency and growth and having those systems in place. I guess to take a little step back to the charging side of stuff, I know
Yeah.
some of the research you've done. One of the slides you kind of shared with me in advance that was interesting, and I don't think it was terribly surprising, but just kind of having the data around it was around like the perceived barriers to buying an electric car
Hmm.
and how they've kind of changed over time. And the kind of the three that you cited or showed were kind of like low mileage range, they're too expensive, and then lack of charging stations. And it's been interesting to see how that's kind of changed over time. And I'd be just kind of curious to expand upon that and what you're
Hmm.
seeing, and maybe like how you're kind of talking with these, and what those conversations are leading to from this research.
Yeah, I mean, and so to give kudos to Cox Automotive, who puts out a survey every year tracking consumer behavior, and a lot of good firms who work on that issue. JD Power is another one. I think it's the way I've always tried to frame this is, if you're addressing the major issues that people have with a product, right, you're going to make them more comfortable with getting it. And so seeing things like low mileage range being less of a concern and kind of falling only highlights that you're seeing more and more electric vehicles go for 250 miles on a charge, 300 miles on a charge, 350 miles on a single charge. And that's a real shift from 5 years ago, but really 10 years ago, that kind of first gen, second gen Nissan Leaf. On charging, as we kind of discussed, more and more people are seeing charging stations around them. In the deck I sent you, I thought you were going to go in this direction, Chase, around the Pew Research study that shows just how different people's behaviors or willingness to buy an EV is when you live a mile away from a charger.
Yeah, I wanted to cover that too. So let's cover anywhere and everywhere you want to go, because you threw all this great data. I definitely want to go through it. It is all really fascinating.
But it illustrates that like this is something that can change over time. And Alex and the comms team does a lot of great research at ZETA as well. And it's this idea that perception isn't sunken, right? That people do have questions and maybe anxieties around switching to electric vehicles, but they aren't necessarily deeply held in a negative sense, right? I think people are more and more willing to learn more. And then finally, on the kind of expensive, we talked a little bit about this, but I think to just reiterate this point, if you go to Edmunds and you look at the average new vehicle price end of last year, beginning of this year, all pre kind of the current tariff conversation, but about $50,000. And if you look at the highest selling electric vehicles out there in 2024, a lot of them are in that $40,000 to $50,000 price range, below that kind of average. So whether you're talking about the Model Y, whether you're talking about an Equinox, whether you're talking about Equinox EV, talking about a Honda Prologue, there are success stories out there as more and more of the kind of mainstream market has become accessible. So on each of those three issues that Cox listed in 2023, it's this idea of improvements have been made, but there's more to go. And I think that's heartening because it's not an insurmountable challenge. I think, frankly, the biggest challenge right now might be the uncertainty around both federal policy and kind of market conditions. But the fundamental concern that people have with EVs is moving in the right direction. I think that's a good thing to see.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think everything that you shared was really fascinating, just because it kind of reinforced a lot of the positive momentum I've seen, and kind of made it, instead of anecdotal, really drew a lot of those numbers to it. But yeah, let's kind of expand some of these other things that you shared. I think obviously the Pew Research one is really fascinating, and where do you want to start, or what's really staying out to you at the moment?
Yeah, well, let's talk about the Pew Research one since we're on charging, and then if we want to go, I want to pull it up in front of myself just so I'm accurately citing it. But basically, what Pew did, and this was released last year, but over kind of a couple research periods and survey periods, they looked at adults who lived a certain amount of miles away from a charging station and said, are you likely to consider purchasing an electric vehicle as your next purchase, or a hybrid vehicle, or currently on an EV or hybrid, depending on how far you live to a charging station. And not surprisingly, those who lived less than a mile away from a charger were somewhat likely to seriously consider purchasing an electric vehicle the next time. And I'm reading that very carefully because, as you know, with any survey, the words you choose is very important. About 47%, so nearly half of the participants who live less than a mile, saw this as a positive, future kind of oriented vehicle. 1 to 2 miles, a bit less, about 38% of the respondents. And then if you were more than 2 miles, it was about 27%. So again, that kind of positive relationship with how close you live to a charger. Another question was, how confident are you that the US will build out a charging infrastructure network? And not surprisingly, the closer you live to a charger, the more confident you were. Again, the confidence level wasn't nearly as high for the charging build out as it was for the considering an EV. Which means that there's more work to do, I think, in ensuring that consumers are confident. Again, the survey was a couple years ago. I think, like anything, you always want the latest data, but stuff like this probably takes a bit longer than other survey types.
Yeah, I think one other interesting thing that I was kind of even reminded again, talking about just the current state of EV charging this past week at the EV Charging Summit, was there's still a lot of work to be done around just the visibility of electric vehicle
signage.
chargers. Yeah, and I'm kind of curious what your team is seeing or kind of heard around that, because I think that's totally true. I think there's a lot more people that are probably a mile or pretty close to EV charging and just probably aren't seeing it visually, so they don't really realize. And I think that's what's so important about this dynamic. When you hear numbers like that about the interest and how that ties to kind of the confidence people have in going electric, that a lot of the time I think there's just a big challenge in that visibility.
Yeah, I don't have a research point to kind of direct you towards. I think signs are always a good thing. And I think Also, a lot of these EV charging companies are new, right? Outside of maybe a well-established brand like a Tesla charging that you've heard of, other ones, may not be a company you're familiar with, or they're just kind of building up more and more chargers. The other thing is, which I'm sure having two EVs is when you own an electric vehicle, the EV itself will direct you towards charging stations, right? So I think a lot of times the signage is, more so for those who don't own an EV to be like, oh, this is here and a real thing. You're also seeing more electric vehicle charging stations that are designed maybe similarly to a rest stop or a gas station, and maybe less that are kind of in a mall back parking lot. A lot of interesting articles out over the past year, kind of looking at some of the new companies and their strategy, and everyone is differing a little bit with how they're playing in the fast charging space. But yeah, I agree that there is a psychological element here, and making sure that people understand that there is chargers around them if you don't have an app. And so it's easy. In New York, you see on some of the garages that there's EV chargers, but when it comes to like the fast charging, if I wasn't kind of in the EV space and attending events where you hear about X Hub being built out, I wouldn't really know.
Yeah, I think one of the things that stood out to me in the conversation I had was around if you're not a person in the know,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe you come up to a Tesla supercharger and it says Tesla on it. You're like, okay, maybe those are charged. But especially if you're by some sort of just average charger, and especially if it's like in the back of a lot and there's no car charging there, the average
Yeah.
person just assumes like that's electrical trans. It's just like something they have no idea what it is and kind of just blends into the background as like being an electrical transformer or something else versus having that like active perception of seeing like a car charging in it to know that's what it
Yeah.
actually is.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's completely spot on. And I think that's also aligns with when you leave, yeah, the early adopter phase of any technology, right, are going to be really well regarded and well known on a topic.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll even date myself and say like I'm a big Nintendo fan, and there's a Nintendo Switch 2 coming out. I'm an early adopter. I know all the details on it and research on it, and we'll look into it. But you're selling to a mass market, whether you're an EV company, video game maker, whoever. When you leave that kind of small phase of the people who are diehards, who understand charging, who understand range, who understand home charging versus L2 charging versus, I mean, some home charging is L2 charging, but versus fast charging, reaching those new consumers and getting them comfortable is really important. And the industry has been working hard at it, but it's on all of us together to help explain, the benefits of charging. I was at an event where, kind of a roundtable thing, and two of the benefits I think that were mentioned around EVs, around charging, that again you have to restate because people who don't have EVs don't recognize it, is one, you never have to go to a gas station again. And that is such a seismic shift in how you use your driving time that sometimes I think EV owners almost underappreciate it. My dad will sometimes say like, "Oh, it's been X amount of time since I've been at a gas station," but beyond that, you kind of made the transition and moved on. The other one is just how affordable a lot of charging is. Every state has different electricity prices and different moments where electricity may be in higher demand. But on the whole, there's a lot of good benefit and efficiency to electric vehicle charging as well. So 2 points that, again, until you're like in it or you own an EV, you won't necessarily know, but are important to reiterate.
Are there any other things that you've seen or just kind of noticed that are, especially around any data, that
Yeah.
are this kind of mental shift moments that really kind of realign and make the person think, oh, I didn't really think of it that way, or you're finding a lot of success for people to try and get it to really connect with what's actually happening with electrification?
I think those are two good points there. It also depends who your audience is or what type of person you're talking to. I
For
think
sure.
just like in other technologies, when you have friends who own the product, I think surveys and data has shown that there's a more positive inclination towards electric vehicles versus like them being kind of a far off futuristic thing if like a friend or a colleague or family member has them. Um, this is a little bit of a tangent, but we just put out a poll uh, with a couple of other groups, and I'm even going to pull up the groups here, basically outlining that electric vehicles kind of across the political spectrum are pretty positive in terms of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And so, more and more people see electric vehicle investment here in the U.S. as a important thing. And so that's another kind of shift on top of just the kind of benefits that you see, of stats that kind of draw people to that space. But again, people might not be thinking about it, even if it's a point that they agree with, top of mind. And the overall top line number here, and the other groups that we were working with was in releasing the poll was Centerline Liberties and the Conservative Energy Network. But really, you saw 85% of voters believing that the federal government should support American companies that are aiming to make affordable and powerful electric vehicles, and 76% of Republicans surveyed felt the same way. So it's more and more people kind of are seeing the benefits of this EV industry. But again, I think continuing the conversation or bringing up the kind of advantages and points is key.
Yeah, one of the things you shared with me kind of before this was around like I believe it's over 157 billion in U.S. EV battery and critical mineral supply chain investments, and that's just really since the infrastructure law was passed. And if everything kind of falls through and goes forward, that means you're seeing probably resulting in about 163,000 jobs. Do you see that as being a big part of the reason that there's just becoming such a large kind of cohesion
Mm-hmm.
between like people just being much more open to and for electric vehicles? Because I do feel like there has been a pretty big. I've been surprised by not just the openness to an electric vehicle, because I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I knew quite a few people across the spectrum politically that had some, they were like kind of open to it, but they're like, that's great, but it's not for me. And now it seems to be like, well, maybe that will be my next car. And I'm curious if there's any other kind of trends around that you're seeing. And it really seems like, in my anecdotal experience, a big piece of that conversation is around kind of the job creation and domestic manufacturing.
Yeah, and I mean, you're seeing, ZETA has cited this quite a bit. About 3 or 4 of electric vehicles sold in the U.S. were made in the U.S. You've seen, many electric vehicles final assembled in North America, which is really important, and overall supporting, anywhere between the kind of 190 to 240,000 jobs, depending on how far back you're going to start your data point. And so it is becoming integrated into the automotive industry in a way that is exciting and interesting to follow, and important for the U.S. and global competitiveness. In a previous life when I was at Bloomberg, did a lot of traveling internationally and went to places like South Korea or Japan, and they're just as passionate about their automotive base there as Americans are here for seeing companies succeed. And I think there's a pride in it. There's many people's livelihoods depending on it. And every country, for the most part now, is invested in this EV transition or working to make some type of clean car transition work. I won't say that U.S., South Korea, Japan, China, EU are all exactly the same in their approaches. Obviously, they're at very different places, but the jobs and supply chain here and impact is real. And I think that's what ZETA has been pointing out as it's been going, across the country to show that it's not just about, one vehicle or one company or one subsidy, but really global competitiveness and real, opportunity here in the U.S. In terms of work.
Yeah, I mean, that does seem to be a pretty core. I feel like with some of the international or previously like kind of global messaging around it, obviously a big part of it to start was kind of the environment, and there's still definitely a portion of that. But it really just seems like the biggest thing has been just the connection with messaging globally around the jobs and kind of the future proofing of industry. I'm kind of curious if there's anything kind of what you've talked about in your travels and even some of the slides you shared with me about like anything different from the US's approach versus some of those other countries. And obviously some of that may be cultural and other reasons, but just kind of any interesting trends or things that you've noticed between the US and others abroad around that.
I think to kind of draw something in common, and obviously, like if we were going into a more technical discussion, there's been different levers pulled depending on what type of, frankly, economy or country you're in. And, and don't want to go too far down that road necessarily. But what I will say is that it's this idea of being invested in the EV transition and putting your foot forward and having policy certainty has served a lot of countries really well. Or even if you look at specific state markets in the US, California and Colorado are two that see very high, EV share of sale. And they've had policy certainty and incentives at the state level and programs to address some of the issues we've discussed. In Europe, UK is pretty close to a sister market. They've also had, for a long time, they had purchase incentives. They have, ride hailing or taxi incentives as well. And they have different challenges. I mean, one benefit that we have here in the US that not every country with high EV adoption has is we have the automakers here. Whether you're talking about the legacy OEMs or the kind of newer EV companies, many of which, are ZETA members, that's something exciting to be a part of. There are just some, countries that maybe, do it for an environmental reason or a policy goal. But here, just as, Germany is another example, it's a competitiveness conversation too, right? Because anytime you're leaving a hole on a global kind of market, someone may step in. So it's a big opportunity for the U.S. companies, and I think a lot of them have seen it in terms of, upping their EV adoption, EV investment here in the U.S., but also thinking about their supply chains in North America.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of really great to see, and just looking at the members of ZETA and kind of what they're interested in and what they kind of stand for. It seems like a really interesting alignment around what that kind of future end state is and what obviously the industry is trying to get towards. I'm curious about, and I mean, a lot of the people who are members of ZETA are the battery manufacturers, are the some of the automotive startups, among others that you mentioned. Some of the other ones are the utilities. And I know a lot of what we've kind of talked about so far has been a little bit more on the automotive and the EV charging side. But I'm kind of curious around any of the data, because that's such a fundamental piece, especially once you start getting into like the large, not just DC fast charging, but even like fleet electrification. And I'm just kind of curious around that and what you're hearing and seeing from members in the space.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a better utility, point in the slide deck I sent you. And as a good research analyst, I always say, won't overstep what the data shows or what my experience shows. But I think that, many of ZETA's members and other utilities continue to make investments in EV charging and how they're approaching electrification in their specific region within states. And that's really important work, or how EVs will in the future, interact with the grid. There's excitement and also, challenges around that interaction, outside of the data center and AI questions and all the other kind of challenges that utilities will deal with. So of course, they're a really important part of the conversation here in New York, right? I'm in Con Ed's, jurisdiction. The investments that they're making to increase electrification or to prepare for an electric future. So every utility varies and differs where they're at on this journey. Obviously, California utilities, when your EV share of sale is 25%, you have a lot more EVs on the road. It's a different experience than, where EVs are just getting started. And so I think really important partners, really important to continue to engage and work with. And it's exciting to have them as a part of the team here at ZETA as well, because they offer, a unique perspective. And also, when we were talking about certainty before, right, their utilities have different planning cycles. They have different programs. They have different, regulators.
Kind of a different speed altogether.
A different speed altogether. So definitely an area that I personally need to kind of get up to speed more and continue learning about. Even as like someone in research, you're always learning more and doing more. But, this transition is going to be successful in part because the utilities are there to kind of help ease it along over time.
As far as kind of what you're seeing in the data, what are the trends that have been kind of the most, I don't know, just like the ones that you've been kind of most optimistic and kind of positive about as far as kind of like looking forward with the growth of the industry?
Yeah, this is honestly, it's almost like I'm not saying I gave you this question, Chase, but it's almost a nice tee up to see if one of my former BNEF colleagues listens to this and makes it all the way to, as far as we are in the conversation. So BNEF, Bloomberg NEF, puts out a battery price survey every year, which looks at the actual kind of prices of battery packs and more. And BNEF has been doing this for over a decade and tracks prices back to 2010. So really, a lot of this transition has been pushed forward by the idea that lithium-ion battery prices have fallen, around 90%. I don't have the exact math off the top of my head at this moment, but from that price in 2020, $4, around $1,400 per kilowatt hour, down to $115 per kilowatt hour. And it is such a massive change in how affordable these batteries are that have begun to, impact more of these affordable EVs existing, impact the existence of stationary storage in a major way, and can transform both our transportation economy, but also our power sector. And there's no way that you can't look at that chart and then also all the kind of EV sales charts working kind of in tandem as the battery prices have come down, the EV sales have gone up, and not feel good about the future. BNEF continues to kind of forecast battery prices out and continuing to fall into a cheaper and more affordable range, which will be passed on to consumers. So I think between that and seeing used EV sales begin to pick up, there's a lot of reasons to feel good. I think whenever I have conversations like this, Chase, I always try and be, you know, non-Pollyannish, not say
Yeah.
that, everything will be easy, transitions will take place overnight. One stat I always like to really use is that, like, in the early 1900s, like basically 1910 to 1930, as the internal combustion engine was picking up, there were many different types of fueling used to power gas cars. Kerosene, I think, was one. And so it's not like ICE vehicles, flipped a switch in a year, in
Exactly.
5 years, were dominating the world. Companies like Ford at the time made the innovation, like many companies in the EV space are doing today. But it is a transition for a reason, and I think it's an exciting one to be a part of. But just like any transition, there are bumps in the road. I have so many stats I could throw. I don't have it off the top of my head, but there was a good survey in, like, I want to say the early 2000s around cell phone usage. If people will, like, ever want smartphones
Yeah,
or
yeah.
not, and it was like 20% or so people thought it'd be a thing. And then, here we go. We got the iPhones, all in our all over the place. So it's exciting, and I think there's a lot of reasons to feel optimistic, but also, highlights why groups like ZETA are really important, because there are challenges to address and a lot of uncertainty. When I'm having conversations with friends or industry, what they say, what's going to happen with tariffs, what's going to happen with policy X or policy Y, and there's a lot of news developments every day, and so the big picture story has been really good. And there's a lot more work to do, but I think that kind of keeps you positive and keeps you kind of in the moment where, yeah, you might be getting a bunch of news stories in a single day and trying to figure out what the heck is
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah, I think that's actually an excellent call out because you wind the clock only a few years and really just kind of right before COVID.
Yeah.
One of the biggest things you always heard about electric vehicles is like, well, the batteries are so expensive, it'll never happen. There's no way it'll ever get down to around $100 per kilowatt hour and all these other things. And those are just things that have kind of happened in the past few years, and we've kind of taken for granted and forgotten how much pushback there used to be to that part of the conversation altogether.
We're,
And
we're approaching that kind of price parity. I always used to say Bloomberg that price parity is in a moment. It's kind of a spectrum, over time, because different segments reach price parity depending on your markets. It could be at $125 per kilowatt hour, $100 per kilowatt hour, some even 90. Haven't looked at the numbers at Bloomberg in a little bit, so won't throw stuff out there. But if you look at most studies now in the U.S., again, putting kind of the short-term challenges to the side, we're seeing parity within the next couple of years, and arguably in many vehicles, might be added today.
right.
And so that is a transformative moment, but it can be lost in a lot of noise sometimes.
Yeah, and I mean, I always kind of look back. I mean, the big thing was always that $100 a kilowatt hour mark, or even 150. And it just seems like as we got closer and closer, people would either look for more reasons. Well, actually, it's this, that, and the other. But the more you pulled it apart, the more you realize that that actually number wasn't taking into account so many of the other things that actually make an electric vehicle so much more cost efficient. That sure, maybe
Yeah.
there's some of these upfront battery costs, but they've continued to fall in. And I think what you're totally right about specific industries. Those impacts have been greater than others. And a great one is, as you kind of mentioned, was utility and grid storage power, and how batteries have really taken off in that, because there's so many other issues you run into with when you have to have like a coal peaker plant, that batteries don't have to be dirt cheap, that you're saving already a lot of money.
Money.
And you're already just starting to see that safety and consistency with a lot of these battery grid tied systems.
Yeah, it's
And
exciting to be around. I always feel good when I'm talking to industry people. I feel like that is even though people are, I think there's frustrations around all the uncertainty for sure. But I think people believe in the mission and believe in, working in these kind of growing fields. And I think it keeps people motivated.
for sure. And I think there's just so much. I've always been kind of like a long-term person. There's always short-term noise and all these things that kind of, if you pay attention just from that, it looks like the world's going to end tomorrow or something. But then and I'm always also a person who doesn't like to look back at stuff. But if you just look back 5 to 10 years, you really do see just how far things have come. And it's all stuff that makes you kind of optimistic to see where all of this is clearly going. And I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I mean, it's even that point that I brought up on the US where like alternative drivetrains, meaning BEVs, PHEVs, and hybrids were about 2% of all
Right.
sales in the US in 2015, and were, over 19% last year. So even in the US, change is coming and change has been occurring, which is exciting to see.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect example of what I kind of meant about looking. There were so many people, especially in the automotive industry, that were like, well, it's only 2%. What will it ever grow to? And in such a short time, it's almost 10x that. And
Yeah.
that's where you kind of have to look at not just where it is or what it's been. You have to look at that growth factor to all of it. And one of the other areas I know that I've talked with some of the other members about at ZETA about before
Yeah.
is the work you're also doing with kind of electric school buses,
Yeah.
and some of these kind of traditionally non-passenger EV spaces that have really started to stand out.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the electric school bus one is always a great example because you're having a public health benefit on top of,
Exactly.
just another segment on top of, pilots around electric school buses and the grid. Um, and, really important federal programs that have been, uh, in helping establish factories in places like West Virginia and elsewhere. And it's exciting to see the technology grow. I mean, there's about 500,000 school buses in the U.S., which is massive. In my former life, I worked on buses a little bit as well, and it's transit buses are around 70,000. School buses 500,000. It's a massive market opportunity with different challenges. In a weird way, I almost think that like passenger EVs is consumer product plus renewable energy kind of spin on it. With electric school buses, it does have more of that kind of fleet process, but that means there's different challenges of like how do you get school districts to be able to afford it and to kind of drivers to learn it in a different way. And I think people are always really excited seeing them, which is a good feeling. I mean, I think people are excited seeing passenger EVs too, but just the kind of visceral reaction to running into an electric school bus or going to an event with them is always really fun.
Yeah, and I think it just highlights when people are thinking about this in a way that it's like trying to say these universal truths, or like, oh, this won't work for that. But then you start really breaking it down by industry or need around like what an electric school bus needs versus what a consumer needs for day to day versus kind of what we're talking about with like utility scale grade.
Yeah.
They're serving, they're kind of the same technology, but the way they do it and to what extent they serve does actually have some pretty drastic and impactful differences for those different product lines and industries.
Yeah, and they're at different places in the kind of development of the supply chain,
Yeah,
right? So it's
exactly.
building up economies of scale across the board has been shown as a positive move. And so, buses and trucks, like commercial vehicles, like your vans, put out by Ford Rivian, is moving along quite nicely. Electric school buses, still have a bit of a ways to go. Just like in the passenger EV space, you really got two ways of doing it, right? You could be an all electric startup, or you can be an ICE make traditional diesel school bus maker who kind of learns how to do electric. Same with mail trucks and all of these different functions. But I think there you even see the total cost of ownership benefit more so, right? Where it's like these products are cheaper to run and to fuel, and that's without getting to the ancillary benefits of electrification. Again, we're early on all this stuff, and so
Yeah.
there's different companies being established who are trying. Just like any kind of new industry, there's going to be success, there's going to be setbacks, but it shows that really there's a lot of potential for electrification, and let's just say cleaner technologies across the board. Uh, Aiming towards that kind of zero emission in our title, right? To kind of hit up over the long term more of those heavy duty trucks. All really challenging things, but exciting nonetheless. And maybe we come back in 5 to 10 years and talk about electric aviation, but I think not necessarily today.
Well, I think that's a good tee up for the next conversation. I mean, I'm super passionate about the aviation space, and I think what's happening there is really cool. But that's like a perfect example. It's like where we're seeing the scaling of consumer vehicles. Use case is pretty clear. There's a use case and path to electric aviation, but there's still some kind of technical. When you see like the battery density and where the technology is going, it's likely it will get there. But we're still a little further. We're kind of where like the EV industry with that is maybe a decade, maybe a little more ago, which once again, that's so cool to think that we're seeing that continued growth. But Corey, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed kind of talking about these different topics, but with kind of all the data and research we're seeing to kind of really show that there's so much to be positive about, and it's all growing pretty quickly and changing in a lot of different areas in a positive way. But for those who are curious and want to learn more, what's the best way to kind of follow you and kind of learn more about the work that you're doing at ZETA?
Yeah, so first I'll plug the ZETA website. Always good to keep tabs on what we're doing. We have both kind of, the advocacy work and then a lot of education work on things like, cost of EVs or EV charging. So, zeta.org, got to give the team a shout out. In terms of me, LinkedIn, Twitter, Blue Sky, on all of it. You'll get some EV content. You'll get a lot of basketball complaining about the Brooklyn Nets. So be careful what you sign up for. But it's, you got to be true to yourself, Chase. You can't be business all the time. So usually after work hours, you'll see me complaining about the Nets losing. Although this year, winning or losing, this year I want them to be worse off so they get a better draft pick. So if you want some real entertainment, follow me around the NBA draft, but also really follow ZETA's work around electrification and the kind of efforts on the EV supply chain.
Yeah, unfortunately, as a Portland Trailblazers fan, I can too easily relate to where you're at in that experience as well. But yes, thank you so much. Well, I mean, that could be its own podcast. We got to talk about that sometime too on the situation of the NBA. But this has been really fascinating. Looking forward to having you and other members from the ZETA team back on soon again. It's always really interesting and great to hear what's happening. So thank you so much, Corey.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time, Chase. Hope you have a good rest of your day.
That's a wrap on this episode of Grid Connections. A huge thank you to Corey Cantor from ZETA for joining us and bringing the data, insight, and optimism we need to keep pushing this transition forward. If you took away something valuable from this conversation, whether it was the trends in EV adoption, how battery prices are reshaping the market, or the importance of visibility in public charging, we'd love it if you'd share this episode with a friend or colleague who might enjoy it too. And while you're at it, leave us a positive rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more curious minds find the show. And don't forget, Grid Connections Consulting is now live. If you're looking for strategic guidance in the electric vehicle, energy, or infrastructure space, head to gridconnections.co to learn more. Lastly, get the latest insights delivered straight to your inbox by subscribing to our newsletter. The link is in the show notes. Until next time, this is the Grid Connections podcast signing off.